Good evening, everyone. The time is now 7 p.m., and we're coming to you from rainy Virginia Beach. This is another Military Aviation Museum webinar, and we are so glad to have you all here with us again this evening. We're looking forward to a really exciting topic tonight relating to the Wright Brothers and their first flight down at Kitty Hawk in North Carolina. So a local-ish bit of history again. Our speaker this evening is Mike Fonseca, the president of the First Flight Society. Mike reached out to us early in our webinar program to offer to kind of take us back in time and explore this just incredible innovative spirit that lives with the Wright Brothers and how the First Flight Society seeks to immortalize that. So, Mike, take it away.
Hello, thank you very much. Today, we're going to be talking about the Wright Brothers at Kitty Hawk. And they're associated with Dayton, Ohio, because that's where they're from, but they're really associated, especially when it comes to the first flight, with Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Sometimes you're going to hear things like Kill Devil Hills and Kitty Hawk almost interchangeable. Well, back at the time of the Wright Brothers, there was no Kill Devil Hills as a city or a town. There was a Kill Devil Hill, and we'll go into that a little bit. But typically we'll be referencing Kitty Hawk because that is what that area was back in the early 1900s. So I'm going to start off by just showing you that we're talking about these two guys, Wilbur and Orville Wright. And I'm also just going to kind of start off with a short timeline here. This really starts in 1896 when they decided that they wanted to look into flying and what they called the flying problem. They'd been hearing about Samuel Langley. They had been following Otto Lilienthal, and back at this time is when unfortunately Otto Lilienthal died in a glider crash. So when we got to 1899, they decided to really look into where they could start practicing. So we'll jump a little bit here, and this is just kind of an overview, but 1900, the Wright brothers did their first manned glider at Kitty Hawk, but it didn't go as well as they wanted. So they came back in 1901. Once again, glider, they did a lot of tests, didn't go quite the way they wanted, went home, actually built a wind tunnel and did scientific testing instead of just relying on what everybody else had been using as their references. 1902, they came back, built a third glider, and this one went very well. And I'll go into more detail about this in a minute, but this is kind of give you an overview. And then, of course, 1903 is the big year. December 17th is when they made their first controlled, sustained powered flight at Kitty Hawk. Other people were trying at the time, and you'll see on here we mentioned Samuel Langley. He was close, but he did not get it done before the Wright brothers. All right, here. And now I'll just leave this up for a second, but in 1899, they were looking for a place to test fly a glider. So Wilbur wrote the United States Weather Bureau and asked about locations with high winds. The Weather Bureau sent him a monthly weather review for August and September, including tables for 150 different locations. And they were looking in this, this time frame of August through December because it was actually a time off from their regular business. And at that time, they were bicycle manufacturers. In 1900, they started planning on building a glider. So they were getting everything together. May of 1900, Wilbur Wright wrote to Octave Chanute and asked for advice concerning where to test a glider. And Chanute was somebody that they worked with and corresponded with for many, many years. Chanute suggested several places among the barrier islands on the eastern seaboard. Wilbur consulted the wind tables and found Kitty Hawk, which was 6th on the list. August 3rd, Wilbur writes a letter to the weather station at Kitty Hawk asking for information about the weather and any kind of lodging. On August 16th, he gets written back by Joseph Dosher, and this is the letter that's on here on the screen. He was the chief of the Kitty Hawk weather station and also the chief of the life-saving station. There weren't a lot of people down there at the time. So he wrote back, and you can see in reply to yours of the 3rd, I will say the beach here is about 1 mile wide, clear of trees or high hills, and islands for nearly 60 miles south. Conditions, the wind blows mostly from the north and northeast, September and October, which is nearly down this piece of land, giving you many miles of a steady wind with a free sweep. I'm sorry to say that you could not rent a house here, so you will have to bring tents. You could obtain board. The only way to reach Kitty Hawk is from Manteo, Roanoke Island, North Carolina, in a small sailboat. From your letter, I believe you will find it here, like you wish. We'll be pleased at any time to give you any information. Yours respectfully, J.J. Dosher. So along with that, Dosher also referred Wilbur's letter to William Tate, who was the county commissioner and former postmaster and the only quote unquote banker in Kitty Hawk who had been to high school. So you have to remember, this is 1900. So it wasn't a thing where everybody was going to school. So Tate sent Wilbur a warm response, and he said, if you, in an excerpt here, I will take pleasure in doing all I can for your convenience and success and pleasure, wrote Tate, and I assure you that you will find a hospitable people when you come among us. So Tate's friendly reply decided it for the Wright Brothers to travel to North Carolina Outer Banks, and they began a friendship that lasted a lifetime. In the years after the Wright Brothers' experiments at Kitty Hawk, Tate was a tireless supporter of the Wrights, and in 1928 helped erect the first monument to the Wright Brothers in America. It's a small stone obelisk that stands near the spot that was once Tate's front yard, where Wilbur began building his first man-carrying glider in 1900. It's a very small monument, but it's still there. So back at this time, Kitty Hawk looked like this, which is nothing like, if you've been there anytime in the last, 100 years, it doesn't look like this anymore. But you can see that it was basically sand and dunes as far as you could see, and nothing like what it is now with houses on top of houses on top of houses. So it was a tiny village in what they referred to as the Outer Banks, and we still call it the Outer Banks. Long, narrow strips of land just a few miles off the Atlantic shore. They were entirely made of sand that had accumulated because of the complex interactions between wave action, sea level, and sediment. In the immediate area around Kitty Hawk, the wind had whipped the sand into huge dunes, some of them towering over 300 feet. Just south of Kitty Hawk, there were several especially high dunes known as Kill Devil Hills. The average wind speeds for September were 16 miles per hour. At the time the Wrights were looking for a site for their experiments, Kitty Hawk consisted of a few houses, a post office, a U.S. life-saving station, which you see in the picture, which was to aid shipwreck victims, and a U.S. Weather Bureau station. According to the Weather Bureau records obtained by the Wrights, and I already mentioned this, it was the 6th windiest station in the country. So after hearing about it, they decided this is the place. So September 13th of 1900, Wilbur Wright arrives in Kitty Hawk and stays with the Tates and begins to assemble a glider. By September 28th, Orville, his brother, joined him, and he arrived with camping gear, food, and a mandolin because, hey, where do you go when you don't, where don't you take a mandolin is what I'm saying. He also brings a camera, which was the first ever seen in Kitty Hawk. The brothers stay in a 12-foot by 22-foot tent about a mile from the Tates. They assemble a biplane glider with a movable elevator. They put the elevator in the front of the aircraft. Nowadays, when you look at a plane, the elevator is the little wing that goes up and down that's on the back of the aircraft. They begin to test the glider as a kite, making at least one flight with Wilbur aboard. Wilbur will not let Orville fly until he's sure the glider is safe. Orville begins a humorous correspondence with his sister, Catherine, whom he is very close to. Now, the thing is, we always hear about the Wright brothers, but they did have brothers and sisters. They had one sister, Catherine, and they had two older brothers, Lauren and Richland. You do hear about them every once in a while, and actually, most of the Wright descendants are because of the brothers, as the Wright brothers didn't have any children. Let's see here. In October, the Wrights experience a setback when the wind picks up the glider and smashes it, but they rebuild it and resume their tests. Then we're also going to we mentioned the Tates a minute ago. Here's Tom Tate, who's obviously a fisherman, and he's got a drum in his hand, but if you look behind him, you've got the 1900 glider. He's a 10-year-old. He was William Tate's nephew, and they actually had him up on the glider as they flew it like a kite. Later on, just before they went to go back home, Wilbur made about a dozen free flights. October 23rd, the Wrights break camp and head for Dayton. They're puzzled by the failure of their glider to produce the lift they had calculated, but they're encouraged by the success of wing warping that they had discovered and the use of the elevator. I'm not going to go into a lot of details about things like wing warping, because that's one of those things you hear about in a lot of discussions about the building of the first airplane, but I kind of want to concentrate on what they were doing when they were in Kitty Hawk. So we then move to 1901, and the Wrights decide they're going to go back to Kitty Hawk, and they begin to build their second glider. Because the first didn't produce enough lift, the glider has to have a much larger wing area and a deeper camber, which just means more of a curve to the wing. Octave Chanute, their buddy, asked the Wrights to work with two gentlemen, Edward Huffaker and George Spratt of Pennsylvania, to test a glider in Kitty Hawk that Huffaker is building for Chanute. Also, in June, the Wrights hired Charlie Taylor to run their bicycle shop while they're not there. Charlie Taylor is going to turn out to be pretty important, and we'll get back to him. July 10th, the Wrights arrive at Kitty Hawk and establish camp at Kill Devil Hills, 4 miles to the south, then build a shed to serve as a hangar. They're plagued by mosquitoes and Edward Huffaker. Orville writes Catherine saying that he can't decide which is worse, the mosquitoes or Huffaker. So that didn't keep them from having Huffaker and Mr. Spratt down a number of times. In July, the Wrights tested their glider with Huffaker and Spratt helping. It doesn't fly as well as their first glider. Once again, it does not produce the expected amount of lift. It also shows a pronounced tendency to dive or climb. The Wrights begin to suspect that Otto Lilienthal's lift tables are wrong. The diving and climbing problem they deduce is caused by their wing design. The deep camber causes the center of pressure to reverse itself quickly as the wing's angle of attack changes. This in turn causes the nose of the glider to pitch up or down. The brothers trust the glider wings to take some of the curve out of the ribs and reduce the camber. In August 4th, Octave Chanute arrives at the Wrights camp. So here we've got a picture, and we see Edward Huffaker, Octave Chanute, and Orville and Wilbur. And what's interesting is this building is actually the hangar for the glider. They're staying in the tent to the left. August 8th, the Wrights tested their 1901 glider, and it performs reasonably well, although it isn't as responsive to its controls as the 1900 Wright glider. Orville makes his first flights. Also in August, when Wilbur Wright attempts a turn, the glider behaves oddly. The increased drag on the high wing, the wing that's generating the most lift, causes the glider to yaw in the opposite direction of the intended turn. The Wrights are perplexed. Come mid-August, Chanute, Huffaker, and Spratt depart the camp. Not much later, August 20th, the Wrights, discouraged, break camp Wilbur comments to Orville that it could take 1,000 years before manned flight is a reality, so they're a bit discouraged. Later, Wilbur remembers his dark mood. We doubted that we would ever resume our experiments. At this time, I made the prediction that men would sometime fly, but it would not be in our lifetime. So then we jump ahead to 1902, and the Wrights planned their third glider, this time with a much greater scientific understanding of aeronautics and wing design. You have to remember that these guys had a high school education. They didn't go to college. They weren't engineers. So in August of 1902, August 28th, the Wrights arrived back in Kitty Hawk. They repair their shed and build an extension. September 8th, the Wrights begin to assemble their new glider. It has a fixed tail that the brothers hope will overcome the wing drag that caused the 1901 glider to yaw in the opposite direction. September 19th, the Wrights begin testing the 1902 glider. Let's see here. This is actually a little previous, but we'll jump here and show you the actual 1902 glider in action, actual photograph from 1902. Let's see here. September 23rd, Orville Wright crashes and nearly destroys the 1902 glider, but the Wrights rebuild it. By the end of September, they resume their tests with a repaired glider. The very end, September 30th, George Spratt, who's been there before, and their older brother, Loren, arrive at camp for a visit. October 2nd, Orville Wright suggests converting the fixed tail to a movable rudder to eliminate the well digging problem. Wilbur agrees and they do so. They connect the rudder control to the wing warping system. October 5th, Octave Chanute and Augustus Herring arrive at the camp, bringing with them another glider, this one built by Charles H. Lamson. It has oscillating wings that Herring and Chanute hope will make it stable in the air. October 8th, the Wrights' modified glider works perfectly with no tendency to spin or well dig. It outperforms the Lansom glider by a wide margin. October 28th, the Wrights break camp, already planning to have a powered aircraft when they come back. So over the winter, let's see here, we're going to see, and unfortunately, these are the kind of pictures you get. It's the back of their backs. But we've got Charlie Taylor working in the shop, and the Wrights inquired automobile companies for a suitable gasoline engine for their aircraft, but they can't find one that meets their needs. So Charlie Taylor begins building an aircraft engine for the Wrights. So then we move ahead to 1903. In the winter, the Wrights begin to design their first aircraft propellers. Up until then, when we were talking about propellers, everybody was basically using boat propellers as their basis. The Wrights realized that that was not the kind of propeller that they needed. So during the design of their propellers, the calculations are complex, and there were many heated arguments between the brothers. And in April of 1903, and so this is still back in Dayton, they complete their first set of propellers. Excuse me. Octave Chanute, also in April, lectures the Aero Club de France on the gliding experiments of the Wright brothers. They are astonished at the Wrights' accomplishments, and the news galvanizes a number of them into action. Chanute also gives them the impression that the Wrights are his pupils, which not exactly the case. September 25th of 1903, the Wrights returned to Kitty Hawk after years of glider practice. They are still practicing with gliders, and they continue to fly their 1902 glider, and then they build a new hangar for their Flyer. November 4th, when the Wrights test their assembled Flyer for the first time, it damages both propeller shafts. George Spratt, who had come in October, took the shafts back to Dayton with instructions for Charlie Taylor on how to rebuild them. And that's the thing is, there's not a matter of, hey, I'll just call up FedEx and we'll just send it back. It means you get on a boat and then you get on a train and you head back with the parts, and you have to come back with the fixed parts. In November, Octave Chinook came and visited the Wrights at their camp. In November, around the 20th, the Wrights received the new propeller shafts, but find the drive sprockets come loose on the shafts when the Wrights swing the props to start the engine. So the next day, the Wrights elect to use bicycle tire cement to glue the sprockets to the shafts, and the cement actually works. End of November the 28th, after the Wrights make several tests, one of the new propeller shafts cracks. Orville takes it back to Dayton himself to remake it. So basically, Wilbur's down there by himself until Orville returns December 11th with the new shafts made of solid spring steel. December 14th, this is the day where they flipped the coin and Wilbur actually won. So it looked like he might be the first one to actually fly the plane successfully. But unfortunately, with him at the controls, he misjudged the effect of the elevator. The machine shoots up 15 feet, stalls, and plows in the sand. 105 feet from the point of takeoff. Neither Wilbur or Orville consider this a true flight since the airplane was never under Wilbur's control. So it actually takes a couple days for them to repair it and also for the weather to be decent enough for them to try again. So December 17th at 10:35, it's Orville's turn because of the coin toss. And to be fair, it was Orville's turn. He made the first powered flight in a fully controllable aircraft capable of sustaining itself in the air. I'm sorry, I got a little behind on my slides here, but you can get an idea of, there's the flyer, we've got their hangar, and they actually had moved to a wooden shed as opposed to just a canvas tent. And there is the famous, probably one of the most famous photographs ever taken. And it was taken by John Daniels. And the amazing thing is, essentially, Wilbur said, hey, hold this, and as soon as you see the plane take off, click the shutter. And of course, they had no idea if they got the picture, and no instant pictures on your camera phone. And it took a while before they saw if they actually had a picture. And he literally took one picture, and this is the picture, and you see how it turned out. It couldn't be more perfect. The very first flight lasted just 12 seconds and stretched about 120 feet. In the next few hours, Wilbur and Orville took turns. They made 4 flights. The longest was 59 seconds, and he went 852 feet. After the 4th flight, a gust of wind rolls the aircraft over and smashes it. So the Wrights sent a telegram to their father telling him of their success. The family wanted him home by Christmas. The wreck of the plane made him go, okay, I think that's it. We're going to turn around and come home. They did send this telegram to their father, and that is the actual telegram, and it was out of Norfolk, Virginia. So that is actually the end of my first part. The second part's a bit shorter, but that was about their actual flying from 1900 to 1903. Being the president of the First Flight Society, I've got to mention the First Flight Society a little bit, but it also ties in with the Wright Brothers directly and with the Wright Brothers National Memorial in Kill Devil Hills. So most people don't realize it, but without the First Flight Society, there would not be a Wright Brothers National Memorial. Here's just a couple brief facts up here about the First Flight Society. It was founded in 1927 as the Kill Devil Hills Memorial Association. 1928, the first celebration, which was the 25th anniversary, and the cornerstone of the monument was laid. It was completed in 1932, and the Kill Devil Hills Monument, as it was called, was dedicated. In 1951, the Kill Devil Hills Memorial Association became the Kill Devil Hills Memorial Society. And then in 1966, we changed our name to the First Flight Society and began the Paul E. Garber Shrine, where we honor luminaries of aviation every year and induct them in on December 17th. So just to tell you a little bit about how this all came about, there was kind of a period of big interest in flight in the 1920s, especially with Charles Lindbergh's nonstop flight from New York to Paris in 1927. The increased flight activity of the 20s encouraged a public recognition of the Wright's place in history. So at the local level, North Carolinians led by W.O. Saunders, who was the publisher and editor of the Elizabeth City Independent, he went ahead and organized a group called the Kill Devil Hills Memorial Association. They wanted to commemorate the Wrights. A long-standing champion of Outer Banks causes, Saunders progressively pushed for economic development with a memorial to the Wright brothers seen as part of that development. Other important players included Frank Stick, who is a real estate developer from New Jersey interested in promoting the Outer Banks, and North Carolina administrators and politicians such as Frank Page of the North Carolina Highway Commission and R. Bruce Etheridge, director of the North Carolina Department of Conservation and Development. So to get this going, they had to get some people on board. So they actually had a group of about 46 local businessmen. They turned around and said, all right, well, we got to get some politician in power to be able to do something. So they got U.S. Representative Lindsey Warren of North Carolina to introduce a bill for the Wright Memorial to Congress on December 17th, 1926, the 23rd anniversary of the first flight. Senator Hiram Bingham of Connecticut introduced a similar bill in the Senate the same day. Representative Warren enlisted the support of Orville Wright and the National Aeronautics Association. Frank Stick and other New Jersey investors donated the land at Kill Devil Hills. The act passed both houses of Congress and was signed by President Calvin Coolidge on March 2nd, 1927, establishing the Kill Devil Hill National Memorial. We'll get to that in a second, but something interesting to look at. The specifics of the Wright Brothers Memorial Act called for a monument to be erected in honor of the brothers' achievements at Kitty Hawk. As governmental members debated the design and location of the memorial, the Kill Devil Hills Memorial Association lobbied for construction of a bridge to the Outer Banks and a new road connecting Kitty Hawk and Nag's Head. The memorial offered an incentive for tourists to visit the area and therefore provided a justification for new roads and bridges. So you can see, as you've seen in the pictures, it was all sand and nothing like it is today. And you can actually say that the Wright Memorial is a big reason why there are the bridges and roads that are there now. Neither Congress or the Fine Arts Commission could agree on what the memorial should look like. There were about 35 designs that were presented. Some of the ideas were bizarre. Senator Bingham wanted a Greek temple made from granite from his home state of Connecticut. Time was drawing short because the anniversary was in 1928, was going to be the 25th anniversary. So they decided to lay a cornerstone on the top of Kill Devil Hill for the anniversary and decide later on the nature of the monument. At the same time, they decided to place a commemorative 6-foot granite boulder at the spot where the flyer took off. There was a problem. No one knew for sure where that spot was. In the intervening 25 years, the sands had shifted. And that boulder that we're talking about is right there in this photograph. Fortunately, they found 3 surviving witnesses of the first flight who were willing to help find the spot. 2 of them had been from the life-saving station, and 1 had been a boy who just happened to wander by. On November 4th, 1928, they met and came to an agreement as best they could as to the exact location. So when it came time for the anniversary in December, the plan was to hold an international civil aeronautics conference in Washington, D.C. Orville Wright and members of his family would be honored guests. After the conference, the 200 attendees would travel to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina for the ceremony. The problem was the underestimation of just how difficult it was going to be to get 200 people traveling to Kitty Hawk from Washington, D.C. back in those days. The road down the Currituck County, North Carolina peninsula was under construction, but was not finished. There was no bridge at the time over the Sound to Kitty Hawk, and there was only a crude road in the sand through Kitty Hawk to Big Kill Devil Hill. On Saturday, December 15th, the 200 conference attendees boarded the steamer District of Columbia for the trip to Norfolk. The first of many problems presented itself before they even left dock. A heavy fog delayed their departure for 4 hours until 2 a.m. The continued presence of mist and patches of fog meant the slow passage to Norfolk and necessitated a stay on the steamer overnight. So not as pleasant as all that, and they're not even there yet. So the next day they piled onto buses for the trip down the Currituck Peninsula. That part of the trip went well until they reached the end of the paved road. The buses could not negotiate the rest of the way, so everyone was transferred to a fleet of 70 automobiles. In some places, the automobiles had to detour around muddy roads by driving over residents' front yards and farmlands. After reaching Point Harbor at the end of the peninsula, they transferred to a ferry. On the ferry trip to Kitty Hawk, one man somehow fell overboard and almost drowned before being rescued. At Kitty Hawk, another fleet of cars driven by local farmers drove the attendees through the sand to Big Kill Devil Hill. Along the way, the nice ladies of Dare County treated them to lunch. The last challenge for the attendees was the tough climb up the 90-foot Big Kill Devil Hill for the ceremony. That ceremony on December 17th went according to plan, except for high winds that made it almost impossible for anyone to hear the dedication speeches. Some of the people giving speeches were Senator Hiram Bingham of Connecticut and Secretary of War Dwight Davis. Orville Wright placed sealed documents and descriptions of the first flight in a special box in the cornerstone. Orville, typically modest, turned to Congressman Warren, whose idea it was to build the memorial, and said this whole thing might be a mistake. To do it now seems like an imposition on the taxpayers. Well, I guess that didn't really make any difference because they certainly did go ahead with it. Everyone went back down the hill and reassembled at a spot where they were for the takeoff of the first flight. There, the 6-foot boulder was dedicated to mark the event, and famous aviation pioneer Amelia Earhart stood next to Orville during the ceremony. Well, in this picture, they're not right next to each other, but that is Amelia right there, and over on the left is Orville. The National Aeronautics Association provided the marker carved to resemble a boulder. Also at that ceremony on December 17, 1928 was the beginning of the annual wreath laying ceremony that happens every year in what is now the Wright Brothers National Memorial Park of the National Park System. The trip home after this might have been a worse experience for some of the people. Many automobiles left early because of the cold, leaving several attendees stranded. This caused some of them to miss the returning ferry. They were diverted to a leaking rum runner patrol boat that proceeded to get lost. So maybe not the best experience all the way around, but historically significant. As far as the actual memorial, in June of 1928, the Office of the Quartermaster General announced a competition for designing the monument. Now, this is an interesting kind of small world thing. The company that won the competition was the design firm of Rogers and Poor, New York architects. But the small world thing is one of our lifetime members is also named Alfred Poor, and he is the grandson of the man who designed the monument. So in 1928, the Quartermaster General prepared a report suggesting that the top of the largest hill, Kill Devil Hill, would be a suitable location for the monument. So they had made that decision, and then we saw that we had this first 25th anniversary there. But the problem is nothing had remained of the camp buildings, and a lot of things had changed. So in fact, they think that Kill Devil Hill itself had moved by approximately 450 feet. Also in 1928, the Coast Guard and local citizens began the first stabilization efforts planting shrubs and sandgrass around the basis of the slopes to try to keep it from moving. So in selecting the design by Rogers and Poor, they decided that they were going to do an Art Deco inspired masonry shaft with a base of 60 feet set on a star-shaped foundation. The triangular shaft was embellished with relief carvings symbolized stylized, sculpted wings on the east and west sides. The design implied ancient Egyptian motifs, an important source for Art Deco designs. The design was officially selected on February 14, 1930, but prior to the memorial's construction, the War Department selected Captain William H. Kindervater of the Quartermaster Corps to prepare the site for construction and to manage the area landscaping. To secure the sandy foundation, Captain Kindervater selected Bermuda grass to be planted on Kill Devil Hill and the surrounding area. He also ordered a special fertilizer to be spread throughout the area to promote grass and shrubbery growth, and decided to build a fence to prevent animal grazing. Then spread 2 inches of mulch extending 300 feet up the hill. And then he planted a hardy mixture of imported grass. Once that took root, he extended up the rest of the slope. Along with the grass, a cactus known as prickly pear was added. It hugs the ground and grows to the size of a pear. It may have been an effective ground cover, but to be honest, it's still there. And if you've ever walked through it, you felt it. It took about a year for the vegetation to stabilize the hill, and then work on constructing the monument itself began in February of 1931. With the strong foundation in place, the Office of the Quartermaster selected Marine Captain John A. Gilman to preside over the construction project. That'll give you an idea of some of the stabilization up on the screen, and I'll jump ahead a little bit, and here's the beginning of the actual construction. The construction began in October of 1931, and with a budget of $213,000, the memorial was completed in November 1932. In the end, 1,200 tons of granite, more than 2,000 tons of gravel, more than 800 tons of sand, and almost 400 tons of cement were used to build the structure, along with numerous other materials. It is constructed of granite mined at the North Carolina Granite Corporation Quarry Complex. Foundations were sunk 35 feet into the hill. The base on top of the hill consisted of a 5-pointed star. Above the star rose a 60-foot high triangular pylon, making the total height of the memorial 151 feet measured from sea level. Marble from Salisbury and Mount Airy were used in the construction. The Willis and Mafera Corporation of New York began construction of the monument, and it was completed in November 1932, as I said. So the last major thing was to dedicate it. So on November 19th, 1932, the Kill Devil Hills Monument was dedicated, so that was its first name. Unlike the trip for the cornerstone laying in 1928, this time the trip for the participants was much easier. The roads to Kitty Hawk were paved, and there was a new bridge appropriately named the Wright Memorial Bridge, connecting the Outer Banks with Currituck Peninsula. And that bridge is still there and is the bridge you drive across if you go to visit the Outer Banks. The weather, however, was another story. A heavy downpour of rain drenched a weather-reduced crowd of attendees. A makeshift canvas covering stretched over the speaker's platform as the shelter was torn away by the wind. The airship Akron was turned away. Airplanes based at the Army's Langley Field were unable to take off, but a Navy biplane and 2 Coast Guard seaplanes were able to fly over the celebration and dip their wings in salute. An address by Congressman Warren was cut short, and a letter from President Herbert Hoover, who was unable to make it, was read by Secretary of War Patrick Hurley. He then handed that speech to Orville, who said a simple thank you, placed the speech in his pocket, and he was done. Pilot Ruth Nichols unveiled the granite pylon as the national anthem was playing, and that's what you see in the picture. And it was played by the Coast Artillery Band from Fort Monroe, Virginia. An interesting note is that Orville was not listed on the program at his request. When it was time for him to come forward, many people in the densely packed crowd did not recognize him, and he had to push his way through to get up to the monument. And this is an interesting thing. Orville Wright was one of the few Americans to have a national memorial erected for him while he was still alive. So let's see here. You can see in the picture here, Orville Wright is standing next to the G in genius. So that's kind of like a group photo afterwards. And this is what the memorial looks like now. In 1951, the Kill Devil Hills Memorial Association reorganized as a national society, hoping to raise awareness about the 50th anniversary of the first flight, which was celebrated in 1953. The Kill Devil Hills Memorial Society hoped to raise funds for land acquisition, a museum, a reconstruction of camp buildings, and eventually an airstrip. These plans marked a shift from commemoration to comprehensive interpretation of the landscape, which is exactly what we've got now. You do have a visitor center, an airstrip, reproductions of the buildings. So the one last thing I'm going to mention is that in December 17th of 2003 was the Centennial flight. It was a big production celebrated at the park. The ceremony was hosted by John Travolta and included appearances by President George W. Bush, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Chuck Yeager, among others. The Centennial Pavilion was built for the celebration and housed exhibits showing the Outer Banks at the turn of the century, the development of the 2003 replica that was on display, and NASA provided displays on aviation and flight. Over 30,000 people were in attendance at the Wright Brothers National Memorial to commemorate their achievements 100 years before. When the Outer Banks had limited dirt and sand and cart paths, a local population of only a few hundred residents, as you've now heard, things were definitely a lot easier to get to in 2003. And I actually went to the celebration. It was quite a thing. Unfortunately, on the 17th, it was not just, actually it wasn't that windy, but it was raining the entire time. And the planned recreation of the first flight did not go as planned, unfortunately. But all in all, the days leading up to it were quite a thing, with pretty much every plane you've ever heard of or wanted to see flying over the monument. And that is pretty much what I've got about both the Wright Brothers in Kitty Hawk and the memorial in Kitty Hawk, or Kill Devil Hills now. And so I think that means that we're now open for questions. Is that right?
Yes, that is right. So folks, if you have questions, I know some of you have been entering them, so I've got a bit of a list here to work from, but if you have more questions, feel free to key them into the question window now, and I will ask Mike to elaborate. Mike, one of the first questions we've got here is just exactly how deep is the foundation on that monument, given the sort of sandy and shifting nature of what's beneath it?
Well, the only thing that I've got is what I read to you is that they're pushed 35 feet down into it. And really, now what's interesting is when you look at it, you'll see that there are a number of little buildings around it, a pump house and a power station. But I'll be honest, I have to look. All I saw was that they had put in, they dug in 35, I believe that's what I read, 35 feet. But I may actually have to go look a little deeper into that because I'm not 100% sure.
It's certainly a different sight to see it all stabilized with grass. And I know after visiting there several times myself, that was a question that I had, was this grass a sort of intentional stabilization feature? Mike, could you talk to us a little bit about how we can all be involved and how we can support your mission of recognizing this incredible achievement, and kind of what it is we as a community can do to support you?
Oh, that's a great question. We are always looking for members, and back in 2003 at the Centennial flight, we had a high of about 3,000 members. It's considerably less now because it's not all the big to-do about the 100th anniversary. And I think some people think that maybe they're only having a big celebration, every 25 years or what have you. But actually, every December 17th, we have a ceremony in honor of the Wrights, but also, as I mentioned before, we have the Paul E. Garber Shrine, and we elect someone in every year to be inducted into the shrine. And if they're alive, or if any of their relatives are alive, we usually invite them. So for instance, last year, our honoree was Colonel Gail Halverson, also affectionately known as the Candy Bomber, who was part of the Berlin airlift. And the gentleman is 99 years old, and he was at the ceremony. He spoke. He was just as nice and as with it as you can imagine. And you know, I think that really adds is when you can actually have one of those people there, or at least their family members, because the year before we also had Katherine Johnson was awarded. She wasn't in shape to come down, but her family was, and we had quite a big celebration also. So the fact that we have that celebration every year, we're always looking for members, volunteers, and we're always looking for people to make donations, because unlike you know, some of the nonprofits out there, we are not funded by the government in any way, shape, or form. We're funded by private individuals and businesses. And a lot of times we get a lot of support from the businesses in the Outer Banks, but we also get support from all around the country, and we're always looking for that too.
Well, that's certainly gives us a lot of opportunities to think about, you know, individual opportunities to support you, but also institutional opportunities to collaborate. I know we've been working on some summer camp programming for here at the museum that would emphasize the contributions of the Wright brothers. Before we move on with questions here, there's a kind of an interesting question has been posed. Did the Wrights return in 04 and 05 to continue honing their flying machine, or did they kind of move on to testing closer to home, perhaps Dayton and so on?
Right. They did a lot of their testing in Huffman Prairie near Dayton. They did come back, but you know, everything they came back for was just further glider testing, and they actually held a number of glider records for years, but they never did come back with a motorized Wright Flyer to Kitty Hawk. And what's interesting is, and I can talk about it just for a second, is the actual flyer, as you heard me say, was actually damaged after those first flights on the 17th. They boxed it up and they sent it home. So the one you see, actually, the one that you see in the Smithsonian actually has some repairs to it. It is the actual flyer, but it's been repaired because it was broken after those flights. There was kind of a rivalry, or I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but with the Smithsonian, because the Smithsonian continued to say that Samuel Langley was the first to fly, and Samuel Langley was the head of the Smithsonian at one point. And the Wright brothers said, and really it was Orville, because unfortunately Wilbur died in 1912, but Orville was alive until 1948. He said, hey, the Smithsonian's not getting it unless they say that we're the first, not Langley. So they actually had the flyer on loan to a museum in London, and actually survived all the bombing, et cetera, during World War II. And they really didn't get everything straight till right before Orville died. And then it was put in the Smithsonian. If that hadn't all gotten straightened out, and you know, no one knew he was going to die in 1948, we wouldn't have that flyer sitting in the National Air and Space Museum right now.
You mentioned that there was a little bit of internal controversy within the United States about who had been the first to fly. That was a controversy extended manyfold across other nations and other endeavors to fly. Can you maybe comment a little bit on some of the Euroscepticism and so on that?
Oh yeah, that's definitely
accomplishment
because
of the Wright.
Yeah, the brothers were very secretive, and so, and you know, that the famous photograph wasn't released to the public for years, and people didn't actually see the Wrights fly in public till 1908. So in the meantime, you have a number of people said they flew before them. And that the main one that you hear about is, oh, no, I'm losing my mind, but Santos Dumont.
There you go.
Yes, thank you. I was like, he's a Brazilian who was flying in France. And there are still a lot of people, and I remember back just a few years ago, there was a lot, I think maybe it was the time of the Brazilian Olympics, but the Brazilian pride was like, oh, you guys are full of it, that the United States, that we did not have it. I also hear constantly that they say the Wright brothers used some sort of catapult. And I was like, they actually did use a catapult later, but in Kitty Hawk, there was nothing. There was a rail that was literally made of railroad ties that was the guide. The plane balanced on top of what was essentially a bicycle hub, and there was no catapult. But that's one of these things I keep hearing about over and over. It's, you know, they didn't really fly; they were shot into the air, and it's like that is not the case. So I'd say that Santos Dumont is Alberto Santos Dumont is the one that I hear about the most. Now I also hear, and this one's in the United States, we hear about I don't remember his name, but it's a gentleman from, I think, Wisconsin, who, or was it Connecticut, somewhere, who swore he flew, but he's been completely debunked. I have to look that up too. I cannot remember his name off the top of my head.
The name escapes me as well, but it was some manner of flying boat, and I think Connecticut is right. But apologies to our listeners that I don't have the ability to help with the name on that one. You mentioned that the Wrights were very secretive. It might almost be assessed to a fault to a degree. Can you talk to us a little bit more about what conditions they were looking for that they found in Kitty Hawk? In one of the letters, it mentioned you will find it as you like. What was that referring to?
Well, the biggie was the wind, but there were a number of places with decent wind. As I mentioned, I think they got a list of about 150 places around the country. But part of what they wanted was some place that was isolated where they could work in peace and not have a lot of prying eyes. Because they wanted, besides wanting to fly, they wanted to make money off this somehow. The interesting thing is they kept trying to submit it to the US government, and the Army was not interested. They actually made deals with other countries to build airplanes before they made a deal with the United States government. I think Germany might have been the first one, but they had talks with Germany, France, a number of who were very interested, and the United States government was like, well, and so that's what the famous flight trials in Northern Virginia were about, was to show it off to the Army, because the Army came up with all these things. It's got to, you know, meet a certain speed. It's got to stay up in the air for a certain amount of time. And all of that didn't happen until, I'd say it was like around 1908. So, you know, you see that's 5 years after. But the other thing too is they wanted to be able to patent everything, but the problem is their main patent was wing warping, which as you look at an airplane now, no one uses wing warping. It's the same basic idea, but we use elevators and ailerons, and there's no warping about it. So their patent isn't as helpful as all that. And unfortunately, they found they couldn't patent a flying machine. You know, there is no patent on a powered airplane.
I think that's a really interesting thing to reflect on, is that even after this massive accomplishment that changed history in a lot of ways,
Right.
there wasn't necessarily an immediate path to monetization. So it's not like they became fabulously wealthy as a function of this. They would kind of become mired in lawsuits later in life, right?
Yes, yes. They spent a lot of time on lawsuits, and Their big rival was Glenn Curtis. But what's interesting is, and they had the Wright company, and, somewhere along the line, we got the Curtis Wright company. So, they did find that they had to work with others somewhere along the line, but, they really did spend a lot of time, and it kind of makes you wonder. But on the other hand, I'm like, if I had invented a plane, something this, something this earth shaking, maybe I'd be suing everybody in sight too, because it's like, hey, look, it's ours. Don't, don't just take our work and make money off of it without actually really having done anything.
We've got a couple questions here asking what your relationship is with the National Park Service. Obviously, they're the custodians of this monument, and the work that you do supports them in many ways. Can you tell us a little bit more about the relationship between your organizations?
Yeah, we work very closely with the Park Service. We're not a part of them; they're not a part of us. They did take over the monument. I'm trying to think of what year that was. I think it was also in the 30s that they took it over. But we have a really good relationship. The superintendent of the parks down there is Dave Halleck, and we work closely with him and have for several years. And we've always worked with the park over all the years. They're always very helpful when it comes to the celebration in December. We have an agreement that we're going to have that celebration at the park every December 17th. And we work together on a number of different things. We're not always able to support them monetarily, but we definitely support the Park Service every way we can, because they have the same mission we do, which is promoting the Wright brothers and their genius and promoting flight. And so we're always, in fact, I just recently spoke with some of the Rangers talking about, even though it's months away, but talking about the December 17th celebration this year.
I think you'll be able to look out into the crowd and see a lot of us there, because I know it's of great interest to a lot of us that are listening this evening. You mentioned earlier that there's an airstrip there as part of the park, and I think that's one of the nicest things about it, is that you are still able to kind of fly into this historic site. Could you describe its relative location on the park grounds?
Oh yeah, it's actually right near the monument. There's sort of a circular road around the monument. And if you're looking at the monument from the visitor center, if you look over to the right, there are some trees there, but that's where the first flight airport is. It does have, there is like a pilot shack, and it's not a very big airport, but general aviation can fly in there. And a lot of people do. They fly in and then they come take a look at the park. And it's not super busy. The really busy airport down there is in Dare County on Manteo, which is the little island right off of the Nag's Head. And but its location is great because it's perfect what's nice too is when you're in the park and you look and you watch planes taking off and landing. It was also very helpful this last December 17th because we had I believe it was a C-54 cargo plane that was very much like one in the Berlin airlift that flew in and out of there and was parked there for a while too, so that people could come and tour it, take a look.
Well, December's a long way off, and plans must be made. But I think we'd be interested in possibly finding a way to support that event as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about the condition of the monument? We've had a couple questions here about a theft of some statues that might have happened down there. A curiosity as to whether or not they've been found.
Yes, there are two busts of the Wright brothers. As it turns out, they're not the original busts. Those have actually been put away in safekeeping. So when one disappeared last year, they actually broke the the stand, it's made of stone, that was broken, and the statue, the bust, was missing. Within a week, it was found on the beach intact. So it seems like it was some sort of prank, for lack of a better term. I don't think they found who did it, but it has been returned, repaired, returned, and it's back up there. But like I said, luckily the originals that were made were actually put in storage, and these are copies, for lack of a better term. But yeah, it's a shame that unfortunately, somebody thought it would be fun or interesting to vandalize this memorial.
It is unfortunate to see things like that happen, and naturally we'd all prefer if they didn't. We've had a couple questions about the remoteness of Kitty Hawk at that time and the relocation of a significant amount of equipment down there to allow for these flights to happen. Did the railroad take them all the way to where they needed to be, or I understand that at least on one occasion they transited through Norfolk. How did they get down there with their equipment?
Yeah, they actually had giant crates, and they would travel by train down to North Carolina, but typically they would go to the town of Elizabeth City and basically charter a boat over to the Outer Banks, because there was no bridge. There was no other way to get there except by boat. And so sometimes that wasn't all that pleasant if it was rough. And sometimes they just had to wait on the weather to be able to make the trip across to the Outer Banks. But typically their kind of landing point coming from the north was Elizabeth City. And that's how most people ended up getting to Nag's Head, Kitty Hawk, etc. back at that time.
One of the interesting questions that we've been posed just here in the last couple of minutes is how engaged were the locals? Were they aware that history was in the making, or was it just a few specific families that really had an awareness of what was going on out on the dunes?
Well, the thing about it is, it was kind of a fishing village, and probably the biggest the biggest thing there was that life-saving station. And luckily, a lot of those guys, starting with the Tates, but there were a number of other families where the guys were kind of interested in what these northern city slickers were doing there, because if you look at the pictures, the Wright brothers were wearing their suits to do these experiments. They weren't in a t-shirt and shorts like you and I would be. They had their ties on. They had their coats, their bowler hats, and the people who lived there were certainly not dressed like that. They were mostly fishermen. And then you had like all these guys from the life-saving station. So they were actually a big help for the Wrights. And I think some of them thought, well, these guys are nuts. But, there was a total of about 5 people at the first flight. And, I think those guys knew what they saw. But, it wasn't a lot of people. So one of the things I was going to say, and I just learned this in some of my research, is that we saw that life-saving station in the photo. It was approximately where the Black Pelican restaurant is in Kitty Hawk now. And I didn't realize that. I actually thought that it was maybe further down. And obviously that life-saving station is long gone, but I thought, boy, that's really interesting. And the life-saving station is actually where they went and sent their telegram. But so next time you're down there and you go to the Black Pelican, you were there. You were right where the life-saving station was.
And just take a couple more questions to kind of round us out this evening. Why did bicycle builders seek this particular challenge? What do you think it was that was in the DNA of the Wright brothers to tackle a challenge of this scale?
Well, it's funny. Part of the thing, I don't think it has anything necessarily to do with them being bicycle builders. I'm sure that it helped as far as when they actually went to do the the engineering in their experiments, and it also gave them the money to be able to do this. They had been fascinated by flight as kids, not just watching birds, but one of the things was their father, who was a bishop, actually brought them a little French toy that was essentially I don't remember the technical name of it, but it's a French toy that is basically a stick with a propeller on it that you would twirl and it would fly. And they were fascinated, amazed by this. They studied the birds. They kept trying to figure out, how is it that we can fly and how is it that we can solve this problem? And, I think part of it was that joy of discovery and the challenge of doing something that other people were trying to do. And they approached things differently. And I don't know if that was just a function of these two inquisitive brothers or what, but a lot of the other guys, people like Octave Chanute, and were looking at figures and statistics that had been calculated a long time ago, and everybody just kind of took them for granted. And they came up with things like there wasn't a wind tunnel before them. They created a wind tunnel and said, we're going to test all these different wings and wing shapes to see what actually produces lift. Whereas other people had kind of looked at these tables and they started looking at things and going, well, everybody assumes this, but some of this stuff isn't right, including things like the whole business with the propellers. Okay, well, we got propellers on boats, let's use that. And they realized, no, that's completely the wrong kind of thing. That is not what we need. So, the shape of propellers that we use now is the shape they came up with because everybody else was coming up with propellers that were boat engine propellers, which is a completely different, it's a screw, and it's completely different.
It is remarkable to think that it was, just over 60 years between them flying for the first time and us getting to the moon. It's truly remarkable to see how fast aviation advanced from this one point, knowing that, but also to see just how much things have remained consistent in a sense. As you mentioned, their propeller design is grandfather to all the propeller designs on every one of the airplanes here at the Military Aviation Museum in a way. So they obviously did crack some key parts of the puzzle in order to be able to deliver that first flight. Well, that I think brings us about to the end of tonight's presentation. So Mike, thank you so very much for your time this evening, for spending it with us, for sharing stories of the first flight and of the history of the Kill Devil Hills area. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And one thing I wanted to mention that I didn't point out before is there's a lot of information on our website, which is www.firstflight.org. And we've got a lot of information on there. Plus, that's where you can find out how to join. So thanks very much, Keegan. I really appreciate it. This has been a pleasure.
You also mentioned that you guys have been working on a YouTube page, I believe.
Yes, we do have a YouTube. It's called, if you look up First Flight Society on YouTube, you will find it. We don't have a lot of videos yet, but one of the ones that's on there is a video for Wilbur's birthday celebration with one of our board members, who is a reenactor of Wilbur Wright, and he's got a lot of knowledge and does a really nice presentation. And that's available on YouTube and on our Facebook page as well.
Well, thank you everyone again, and thank you to Mike and to the First Flight Society and all the great work that they do. And we'll continue to look for opportunities for us all to collaborate later in the year. And that concludes tonight's webinar. Thank you again so very much for your time this evening.